I ask all of our guests today to please take their seats. Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations will now come to order. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I welcome our invited guests and experts to a hearing on a subject that is very important to the constituents of my district. That subject is the access to broadband. For many Americans, broadband has become second nature, from sending emails, doing work, doing homework, watching our favorite shows, or ordering packages. People count on speedy and reliable broadband to connect with each other, foster new economic opportunities, and engage with the wider world. The need for broadband access was prominently revealed during the coronavirus pandemic, when even more activities moved online. Unfortunately, large sections of rural America, including much of my district, lack reliable access to broadband, putting many Americans at a disadvantage. The lack of broadband access in rural communities, or the digital divide, has been lessened. Billions of dollars spent by numerous federal agencies. And yet, millions of Americans still lack access. When it comes to broadband access, a considerable number of people aren't underserved, they are still unserved. According to the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, at least 17% of rural Americans lack access to fixed broadband, defined as a minimum download speed of 25 megabits per second and 3 megabits per second upload speed. Only about 1% of Americans in urban areas can't access these speeds. That is a population of unserved people, and that is a separate issue from the question of affordability in those areas. If you are unserved, doesn't matter how much money you have, you can't practically gain access. The digital divide is certainly not a new problem. Federal government funding appropriated to help solve the problem hasn't been lacking. The federal government has been funding efforts to close the digital divide for decades and has spent billions of dollars. The problem has not improved as quickly or completely as was expected, and millions of Americans still lack access. Most recently, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021 allocated nearly $48 billion to support broadband deployment in unserved and underserved areas, $42.45 billion through the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, also known as the BEAD program, $2 billion for the Tribal Connectivity Program, $1 billion for Middle Mile Grant Program, and $2 billion for the Reconnect Program. As I noted before the bill passed, no preference was given to unserved areas over underserved areas. The National Telecommunications and Information Administration, known as NTIA, housed inside the Department of Commerce, is charged with administering the majority of these funds. Prior to these programs, from 2015 to 2020, the federal government invested about $44 billion to increase Americans' access to broadband, and yet millions of Americans still lack access. Unfortunately, but not surprisingly, a recent GAO report highlighted how federal efforts to expand access to broadband have been riddled with the classic problems we see with government-run programs. According to the GAO, federal broadband efforts are fragmented and overlapping. Within the many federal programs related to increasing broadband access, there's potential for overlap, duplication, and conflicting messages. Current federal efforts to increase broadband access involve more than 100 programs administered by 15 federal agencies. And yet, millions of Americans still lack access. Now think about that. 15 agencies, 100 programs riddled with lack of coordination. No wonder millions of Americans still lack access. And to make it worse, according to the GAO report from last May, the United States broadband efforts are not guided by a national strategy with clear roles, goals, objectives, and performance measures. Also troubling is that, according to the GAO, the administration has not decided if a national strategy is needed. I would submit that a national strategy is needed. It's necessary. And strong leadership to coordinate all of these agencies' spending on broadband access is needed. GAO has identified the Federal Communications Commission and the NTIA as having significant roles in expanding broadband access, and I look forward to this committee conducting additional oversight of those federal agencies and their spending on broadband. Today, however, I'm curious to hear from our witnesses. We appreciate you all being here. Curious to hear from them about the various challenges currently facing the federal government agencies tasked with expanding Americans' access to broadband, and I look forward to their testimony. And hopefully, soon, millions of Americans who don't yet have access will gain that access. I yield back. Now I recognize the gentlelady from Florida, ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Castor, for her 5-minute opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you especially for calling this very important hearing on the digital divide, and thanks to our witnesses for being here today. Reliable broadband internet is essential to our daily lives. It allows us to fully participate in the economy and education, allows us to see a doctor, apply for a job, and more. But a digital divide persists between those who have reliable and affordable internet and the skills to use it and those who do not. The digital divide is persistent and complex. Challenges include accessibility, affordability, and adoptability. Currently, the Biden administration estimates that 24 million households in the United States lack internet access. This digital divide is a problem in rural and tribal communities, but also in our urban areas where the cost of internet service is still a considerable barrier for millions of Americans. Nearly a third of Americans who do not have broadband in their homes say the reason is because it costs too much. Back home in Tampa, I've worked with neighbors, especially seniors on fixed incomes, who view internet access as a luxury. Working with the Tampa Housing Authority, we developed a plan for seniors to get connected through one of my first community funding projects. Residents told me that reliable internet access opens up employment, allows them to communicate with medical providers, experience cultural activities they didn't have access to before, and even help with homework when the grandkids come over. And as our everyday lives increasingly rely on the internet, it's important that we don't leave any of our neighbors behind. So I'm interested in how Congress can ensure that broadband is deployed across America in an equitable manner. Another particularly troubling part of the digital divide is the homework gap, which describes the divide between students who have home-based broadband access and those who do not. Many students without reliable broadband are forced to squeeze in 2 or more hours of homework at school before the library closes rather than participate with their friends in after-school activities, or venture to a commercial parking lot with free Wi-Fi access to complete and submit their assignments. Although we've made progress towards closing the homework gap through many years of federal and state investments, there is still work to do. Researchers found in 2018 that nearly 1 in 5 teens couldn't always finish their homework because they lack broadband access. And in 2022, that number dropped to about 1 in 10. And while this is good progress, it's unacceptable that in 2023, 1 in 5 teens from working class families often have to rely on public Wi-Fi to simply finish their homework. No parent should have to spend their evening parked in front of a fast food restaurant so their kids can get their homework done on time, and no child in America should have to deal with these digital obstacles to complete their assignments. The federal investments in closing the digital divide reflect the importance and the complexity of this challenge. The GAO reported that taxpayers invested $44 billion from 2015 through 2020 in various efforts needed to close the digital divide, such as planning, deployment, affordability, devices, and digital skill development. Then, in 2021, heeding the outcry from farmers, rural communities, and Americans still stuck in the broadband gap, Democrats delivered $65 billion in a transformational investment to connect communities across the country to high-speed, reliable, and affordable broadband internet through the historic bipartisan infrastructure law. A multifaceted problem like this requires multifaceted solutions that leverage expertise from a variety of agencies and stakeholders. This helps explain why there are so many important broadband initiatives that support a variety of funding recipients and regions and scopes and approaches. For example, the FCC's E-rate program provided discounts on broadband deployments at libraries and schools nationwide, while the Institute of Museum and Library Services grants to states offered support for libraries to expand their services, such as offering digital skills classes. These initiatives are complementary, and they're both important to reducing the digital divide, but it highlights the importance of really the agency coordination to ensure that the investments make it into the communities that need it most. That includes reconciling programmatic differences and deadlines that may make it too burdensome for applicants to take full advantage of the complementary programs available to tackle the issue. And that's where our focus should be. Can we in Congress work with our federal agencies and work together to make sure that every dollar spent, we do it efficiently and effectively so that these initiatives succeed? I look forward to having that conversation with you, Mr. Chairman, and the witnesses today, so thank you again.
Thank the gentlelady. Now recognize the chair of the full committee, Ms. McMorris Rodgers, for her 5 minutes opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Griffith. The Internet provides Americans with the opportunity to earn a living, complete a degree, and receive vital telehealth services, and more. However, as many of my constituents in rural eastern Washington know, millions of Americans still lack access to this essential service. I think about all the excitement around 5G, but I have constituents who have told me we'd be grateful for any sort of a connection. Supporting broadband and that access across our country's large geographic area, populated by diverse communities with varying needs, is no simple task. Millions of Americans still lack access to fixed broadband services, despite our federal government spending tens of billions of dollars on broadband-related programs over the years. This indicates that we need to do better, and we have opportunities for improvement. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, alone appropriated, as others have said, nearly $65 billion for broadband deployment and adoption. This is on top of the nearly $8 billion spent annually by the FCC through the Universal Service Fund for similar purposes. In March, this subcommittee heard from the Department of Commerce's Inspector General, and we learned about their plans for overseeing IIJA implementation and the National Telecommunications and Information Administration's, NTIA, use of the $48 billion it received to implement 5 broadband programs. But NTIA is only one of several agencies that administers broadband programs. Federal broadband programming is scattered among more than 100 programs at 15 different agencies. Unsurprisingly, when GAO inventoried the dozens of federal broadband programs for its May 2022 report, it found fragmentation, overlap, duplication hindering these programs. Today, we hope to learn more about how the government can better manage and better coordinate the agency components that are supposed to be increasing access to broadband services, such as infrastructure planning, affordability, proper devices, and building digital skills. We also must explore how the government can avoid overbuilding or wasteful and duplicating deployment in some areas for the same recipients. This includes making sure that the FCC's new broadband maps are accurate and used by all federal agencies when making funding decisions. Rather than simply assuming a solution is spending more money and standing up new programs, we need to step back. I believe that we need to take a hard look at how we've spent the funds that we've already invested and what lessons we can learn. We also plan to learn more about the challenges stakeholders have faced in navigating multiple federal programs and employing them in a complementary manner, from inconsistent program requirements to complicated permitting processes. We need to reduce the burden on deployment. I'm grateful to the witnesses for sharing their research, their expertise with us. Assessing dozens of programs and identifying opportunities to harmonize can be challenging, but it is necessary if we're going to maximize this investment and ensure that the hard-earned taxpayer dollars are spent with accountability. Surely we all share the goal of closing the digital divide in the fastest, most efficient, and effective way possible. According to GAO, no national strategy exists. No national strategy exists to coordinate and guide federal broadband efforts. Staff from the Executive Office of the President told GAO that they're considering whether a strategy is needed. GAO concluded that without a national strategy, Broadband activities will not be fully coordinated, and they will continue to be at risk of overlap and duplication. Energy and Commerce has previously acted with bipartisan support to ensure that more coordination across the federal agencies happens by enacting the Access Broadband Act in 2020. This legislation tasked NTIA with tracking and coordinating all federal broadband programs. As the principal advisor to the president on telecommunication policies, it is NTIA's job to guide and coordinate the federal government's efforts to close the digital divide. Whether it's programs at the NTIA, FCC, USDA, Treasury, DOT, or several other agencies, it is extremely important that NTIA ensure the efficient use of federal resources to close the digital divide once and for all. We hope to hear more about GAO's conversations with the administration regarding implementation and how this committee can assist through additional policies to ensure that NTIA is coordinating these efforts. I look forward to our discussion today, and I thank the witnesses for being here. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady for yielding back. Now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone of New Jersey, for his 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Access to reliable, high-speed internet is essential for all Americans to fully participate in our modern society and economy. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated our reliance on broadband to work, to study, and to just connect with family and friends. As our future is increasingly online, we must bridge the digital divide and eliminate connectivity gaps that are leaving too many communities behind. Unfortunately, too many American households do not have access to reliable, high-speed internet. They're being left out and are on the wrong side of the digital divide. And there are several main reasons for this. Some people simply live where there is no available broadband. For others, they may not be able to afford the broadband services that are available, or they may lack the skills to fully utilize digital technology. Approximately 24 million American households lack high-speed internet service, and nearly 1/3 of Americans without broadband stated that it costs too much. As our future is increasingly online, we must bridge the digital divide and eliminate connectivity gaps that are leaving too many communities behind. And that's exactly what Congress and the Biden administration did in the last Congress. We made major investments to eliminate that digital divide by holistically addressing broadband access, affordability, and adoption. The bipartisan infrastructure law invests $65 billion in programs to provide affordable high-speed internet to Americans and Native communities around the country. It funds projects to build out and strengthen our broadband infrastructure into rural and underserved communities. It also reduces monthly broadband costs for hardworking American families and ensures that people have the skills needed to fully participate in our digital society. Now, these programs are already increasing internet connectivity for millions of Americans. More than 17 million American households are saving $30 a month on their internet bill thanks to the Affordable Connectivity Program. And federal agencies are working to create comprehensive maps that will ensure an effective distribution of funds to ensure equitable access to broadband across the country. This is a complex challenge that requires the participation and expertise of officials at the federal, state, and local levels. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, and both Congress and the Biden administration have responded to the need for coordination between various broadband programs and their complementary goals. Now, as one important step, Congress created the Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth within the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA, to basically coordinate many of the programs focused on broadband access and digital inclusion. The NTIA has also substantially increased its own capacity to address this expanded role. They are bringing on board the subject matter experts and leaders necessary to assist with grants and monitor their progress. They're putting a thorough and thoughtful framework in place to implement these programs carefully and effectively. And the bipartisan infrastructure law is making a major difference in closing the digital divide, and yet not one Republican on this committee supported the new law. I'm concerned that we're going to hear a lot of fear and negativity about these investments from committee Republicans today, even though they've been talking for years about the need to expand broadband access in their districts. The investments they oppose will do just that. And now House Republicans' threats of a default crisis would undermine our ongoing efforts to close the digital divide. Their default on America bill passed last month would claw back unobligated funding for tribal broadband, students' internet connectivity, and accurate broadband mapping that is so critical in ensuring that we're deploying broadband where it's needed most. And I just think that this Republican approach is wrong. The investments included in the bipartisan infrastructure law are necessary to tackle the longstanding gaps and provide us a real opportunity to completely connect Americans. And we should be working together with our federal, state, and local partners to ensure that every American has access to affordable, high-speed internet. And at that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. I think this is an important hearing. I appreciate your having it.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. That concludes the members' opening statements. I would like to remind all members that pursuant to committee rules, members' opening statements will be made a part of the record. We want to thank our witnesses for being here today and taking the time to testify before our subcommittee. Each witness will have the opportunity to give an opening statement followed by a round of questions from members. Our witnesses today are Andrew Von Ah, Director, Fiscal Infrastructure Government Accountability Office. Thank you for being here. Dr. George Ford, Chief Economist, Phoenix Center for Advanced Legal and Economic Public Policy Studies, and Angela Seifer, Executive Director, National Digital Inclusion Alliance. We appreciate you being here today and look forward to hearing from you all on this important issue. You all are aware the committee is holding an oversight hearing, and when we do so, it has been the practice of this committee to take the testimony under oath. Do any of you have an objection to testifying under oath? Let the record reflect that there were no objections, so we will proceed. The chair advises that you are entitled to be advised by counsel pursuant to House rules. Do you desire to be advised by counsel during your testimony today? And seeing that none request counsel, if you would each rise and raise your right hand. Do you promise? Hang on, I was a little ahead of myself there. Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Seeing that all witnesses answered in the affirmative, you are now sworn in and under oath, subject to the you can sit down. Subject to the penalties set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. With that, we will now recognize Andrew Von Ah for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. Mr. Von Ah.
Chairman Griffith, Vice Chair Lesko, Ranking Member Castor, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today to talk about GEO's work on federal broadband programs. Closing the digital divide in our country has proven to be a vexing task with many dimensions. It's not just about building infrastructure, which has its own challenges in overcoming difficult terrain and in reaching rural, tribal, and remote areas. It's also about adoption, affordability, the availability of equipment, and digital skills. To address this complex issue, Congress has created new programs and existing programs have expanded to include broadband. Our report last year, as has been mentioned, found that there are now 133 federal programs across 15 agencies that can be used to support broadband access in some form or fashion. Just to break those numbers down a bit, we found 25 programs specifically that had broadband as their main purpose. Many of those have overlapping purposes, such as deployment of broadband or for planning or for other purposes. These include programs like FCC's High Cost Fund, Affordable Connectivity Program, Agriculture's Reconnect Program, and new programs in NTIA like BEAD, the Mill Mile, and Tribal Broadband programs. We identified another 45 programs that have broadband access as one possible use of funds. These include things like Treasury's COVID relief funds, for example, and other economic and community development programs. The other 63 programs can support broadband access under certain circumstances. For example, DOT RAISE grants can be used to install fiber conduit when constructing a highway. For many of these programs, we could not identify instances where funding had been used specifically for broadband access. From 2015 to 2020, federal programs invested at least $44 billion in broadband access, and since the onset of the pandemic, which highlighted for us all how critical broadband access can be, Congress has authorized north of $80 billion in new spending. Having numerous programs can be helpful to address a multifaceted issue such as this, and new funding has targeted gaps that previous programs have not been able to fill, such as the tribal and middle mile funding programs. But this fragmentation and overlap has created challenges for the agencies and for the potential recipients of the funding who are trying to address the lack of affordable connectivity in their communities. Having so many overlapping programs creates the necessity for federal agencies to effectively collaborate to avoid wasteful duplication, which is no easy task. The main agencies, FCC, Department of Agriculture, NTIA, and Treasury, have an MOU and processes in place that have been largely effective at limiting duplicative support, but not all agencies and programs are aware of what the others are doing. Agencies have been less successful in aligning programs with similar purposes and leveraging programs to address multiple issues within a community. This is largely because of statutory variations in each program that limit agency flexibility. Agencies have also struggled to set goals, track program performance, and identify fraud risks. For potential recipients of federal funding, the challenges are even more acute. They must navigate a complex web of eligibility requirements, definitions, and deadlines that vary across all the programs. And applicants are hard-pressed to understand which programs that may be best suited for them or they may be most competitive for, and applying to multiple federal programs can be costly. Federal programs also run the gamut in terms of how funding is dispersed. We have grants, we have loans, loan-grant combinations, subsidies, apportionments, reimbursements. Some programs require matching funds, you name it. All of this adds to the complexity and administrative burden on agencies and potential applicants. Potential applicants also have difficulty using programs in a complementary way, such as for deployment of infrastructure as well as for devices and subsidies for the cost of service. And so communities may have to apply to numerous programs with no guarantees that they will be successful. New funding in the IIJA, which presents an enormous opportunity to make significant progress in expanding connectivity, will also exacerbate these challenges. The BEAD program will provide funding directly to states, which will necessitate further coordination between federal and state officials, and create new sets of rules for potential applicants of funding. Fundamental in trying to address these challenges, we recommended that the White House develop a national broadband strategy that can identify overall goals for all of these programs, track program performance and progress, and help align program rules so that programs can work together and identify agency roles and responsibilities. To date, the White House has not produced such a strategy. We also have recommended that agencies improve coordination, set performance goals and metrics for their programs, and identify fraud risks, which agencies have been in the process of implementing. With that, I'll conclude my statement, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you for your statement. Now I recognize Dr. George Ford for his 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Committee Chair Roberts and Ranking Member Pallone and Subcommittee Chair Griffith and Ranking Member Castor and all the members here for inviting me today. I really appreciate it. I think what we're here to talk about is whether we can finally close the digital divide by spending hundreds of billions of dollars on it very quickly, which is what we've set ourselves up for here. I think right off the bat, we have a problem with the aggressiveness with which we will spend it. It is always easy. I can do things more quickly, but it costs more to do it. I suspect that about 20% of the money will be lost in the speed with which this program will be implemented. But there are ways we can think about increasing the productivity of the spending. And while I think that some of this may have been considered by places, there's a lot of evidence that it's not being taken very seriously. Okay? What we need is a goal, very clearly stated goal, or a mission statement, okay, as I like to phrase it here. And that mission statement with respect to deployment is quite simple. You maximize economically sensible connectivity subject to a subsidy budget constraint. Okay, so there's so much money you got to spend, get as much of the gap reduced as possible as long as it's sensible to do it. There are going to be connections where it does not make sense to build a fiber network. Okay, that's just the way it is. Okay, so, for example, with spending $150,000 to pass a single location with an 80% probability of actually subscribing to service over that connection, satisfy that mission statement? And the answer is no. That is an economically insensible decision. About 400,000, 500,000. These are all numbers I've seen. Okay, this is outrageous. That is an enormous waste of money. Okay, and while we think about waste, fraud, and abuse of the scammers on the supply side and demand side of various subsidy programs, the waste and abuse of that kind of spending to deploy a single connection is as bad or worse. And probably if you summed up the dollars, it would be much worse. That's got to be addressed, okay? In my estimation, you should be spending no more than $20,000 in subsidy per connection. Anything above that amount should be put in a bucket and looked at later and try to figure out there's some option, and there are plenty of options today, as I discussed in my testimony. Okay. Under that mission statement, would you threaten subsidy recipients with de facto rate regulation? No, that is against the mission statement. Okay. Would you prefer high-cost union labor? No, that works against the mission statement. Would you impose unbundling requirements on companies who receive subsidies? No, that works against the mission statement. Okay. It's the role of the mission statement is to assess when you want to go outside the task that's before you, which is to make an 8% number as close to a 0% number as you can. That's it. Okay. Don't get distracted with things that don't serve the purpose. Okay. And the purpose is reducing that gap as much as possible. What would that thing tell you on the positive side, the mission statement? It'll tell you to serve the unserved first and serve the lowest cost ones first. Okay? If you want to maximize the number of connections, you start at the cheap ones and you work yourself up to the expensive ones. Okay, that's how you maximize. If you do it randomly or willy-nilly in some way, you get less. It's just the way the math works. Okay? You do not fund competition. Okay? It's wasteful for many reasons. Whatever gain that people get from the competition is just paid for by somebody else. It's not a net gain to anybody, or at least to society. Okay? You don't fund municipal broadband networks. Okay? You can have some sympathy for that sort of thing when they were desperate and nobody was building, but now we got money, people will build. We don't need people who aren't in the broadband business to get in the broadband business. Let's limit the money to professionals, and we'll get better product. Okay, more productivity. We're going to desperately need to look at satellite and mobile as substitutes for fiber. Okay, and real quickly on waste, fraud, and abuse, we really need to focus on the agencies. We need good records about what they're doing, why they're doing it, progress reports, and some clear measurable targets that they're trying to do so that we can then assess the performance to some standard. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding back. Now recognize Ms. Seifer for her 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you. Chair Griffith, Vice Chair Lesko, Ranking Member Castor, members of the subcommittee, I'm honored to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm Angela Seifer. I'm the Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. We advance digital equity by supporting community programs and equipping policymakers to act. We envision a country where everyone has the opportunity to use technology to live, learn, work, and thrive. NDIA launched early 2015 with an old MacBook, an address book of community tech practitioners, and some big ideas. By July 2015, we had 100 affiliates. These are mostly community-based organizations, local governments, housing authorities, libraries. They were leading digital inclusion work in their communities, and they didn't have a community of practice or a voice in Washington, and now they do. Today, we have over 1,250 affiliates in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and 18 tribal entities. Achieving digital equity in the United States would mean that a senior in North Dakota can talk to their doctor from the comfort of their home in winter, that an entrepreneur in Florida has the digital skills to start their own business, and that school kids in Virginia never have to sit outside a Taco Bell to do their homework. The people running local digital inclusion programs are our country's heroes. They would not have made such progress without the swift actions of Congress during the pandemic. Representing the digital equity community, I thank Congress. The increased awareness led to increased attention, efforts, and capacity on the ground across the country. For example, just in the past 6 months, NDIA has trained 154 digital navigators, 30% of whom are serving in rural areas. Digital navigators are trusted guides trained to assist individuals as they seek affordable connectivity, appropriate devices, and digital skills to meet their goals. We recently created the National Digital Navigator Corps, a program designed to build capacity in 18 rural and tribal communities. Prior to the pandemic, we knew of roughly a dozen place-based coalitions which gathered together community-based organizations, local governments, and corporations collectively addressing the digital divide. Now that number's over 60. This year at our annual conference, we hosted 800 attendees, more than double our previous conferences. Capacity is rising. States, territories, DC, and tribal entities are also adding capacity. Within the past year, over 20 states have hired dedicated staff to lead their digital equity planning and implementation efforts. The need for affordable broadband is so essential that it unites people from across geographic and political spectrums. From Alabama to New Jersey, governors have voiced the critical role of broadband connectivity and acknowledged that the Affordable Connectivity Program is an important tool to help close the digital divide. ACP addresses one of the main barriers to broadband adoption, cost, and helps make broadband more affordable for over 17 million households in rural, urban, and tribal communities. The success of the federal broadband investments are inextricably linked to the ACP program. ACP improves the business case for investing in rural areas, reduces household broadband service cancellations, and increases the likelihood that service providers will achieve a reliable return on investment. In the report under discussion at this hearing, the GAO recommended the federal government create a national broadband strategy. We second this recommendation, and also recommend the federal government create a national digital inclusion strategy to capture and leverage the momentum we are experiencing today. A national digital inclusion strategy should include strengthening and supporting local, state, territory, and tribal digital inclusion ecosystems, designation of a coordinating body to facilitate digital inclusion work across all federal agencies, and finally, supporting the creation of public-private partnerships to support local digital inclusion programs. I'd like to thank you for your time and your attention in closing the digital divide. Access to the internet and the skills to use it are not only essential to survive, but to thrive. And thriving is essential to America's promise, the future of our people, and our nation's ability to compete globally. Thank you for having me, and I welcome the committee's comments and questions.
I thank you all for your testimony, and we will now move into the question and answer portion of the hearing. I will begin the questioning and recognize myself for 5 minutes. All right. Dr. Ford, I was particularly moved by some of your testimony because I've heard some of those same stories. I represent the mountainous part of Virginia and deep southwest Virginia, and the folds in the rural, even in the areas that are not quite as mountainous, the folds in the land often make it very difficult. I've seen some of those estimates that you've seen where maybe $120,000 or $175,000 just to hook up one house. Even if they have fiber laid, to the next house over, you've got to go over a hill and down a small valley to get in there. And in fact, a lot of times people think that I'm just talking about the areas that are completely, rural or out in the middle of nowhere. But I represent Montgomery County, which has Blacksburg in it, the home of Virginia Tech. It's very well wired. But if you travel a few miles out into the county, because of the lay of the land, the folds in the mountains, all of a sudden you got people who have nothing. They have zero service. You indicated that you think that there are still too many rural areas that are completely unserved and that we should prioritize those areas that have zero. I agree with you. It was one of the problems I thought we had with some of the legislation that was passed last year, is that if you were so-called underserved, you could be in the same pot of money or competing for the same grant as people who had zero over zero, even if you had something. Yeah. I've got people who have nothing. Ms. Seifer was talking about going to the Taco Bell. My colleague, Ms. Castor, talked about going to a fast food restaurant. I have people who don't have fast food restaurants to go to. The fire department seems to be used in some areas. So I guess one of the things I'm trying to get at is we're in agreement that we shouldn't be spending $120,000 to get to one house where you don't know 100% that they're going to even sign up, and the people can't afford it, and it doesn't make economic sense, but we should look for creative ways. And so you mentioned satellite. We actually had one of the beta tests for Starlink, and I'd like to see competition in that arena, but it's not there yet. Coming. But it's coming, I hope. So what do you think we should do from a federal standpoint to encourage that? I will also tell you that Appalachian Power has worked on some deals, and they did it first in Grayson County, Virginia. Now they're looking at some of my other counties where they will they use their electric and I don't want to say poles because it's usually the bigger lines that they're carrying the lines. They use those to help do some wireless into the community, do broadband off of those. That's been pretty successful in a pretty rural area. So what can we do to make that better?
Well, I think that you're right, that you have to start focusing on what options are available to solve particular problems like that. I mean, sometimes people tend to think, here's 100 homes and it's all gonna cost me some $2,000 a subsidy to make it all happen, and it's hardly ever like that. You could have a mountain, you could have a lake or a river that causes problems. You could have easements with the Department of Transportation that doesn't let you cross a highway because they don't want to fool with it. So there's a lot of those issues, and I do think that we shouldn't get in a super hurry. I know it's important, but we need to really focus on the opportunity to use what services are available, and satellite services are an option today. The capacities can be limited, speeds are pretty good, but they can't just take anybody and everybody, so it's not for everybody.
But if we're saving $120,000, I'm going to hit on Ms. Seifer's point but before my time all runs out. Should we, instead of subsidizing the $120,000 to lay the fiber there, should we be subsidizing the satellite service?
Yeah, I would say yes. It's much cheaper, and I say that in my testimony.
Or helping the public-private partnership that APCO's got worked out where they're
Right,
doing stuff with the
right.
counties?
And you can view that as an option, right, as holding that option to do something later when it becomes more affordable.
Right.
It gets something to them now that's not too expensive.
And Mr. Von, your report indicated that NTIA ought to do a compile and transmit a report to Congress that identifies statutes preventing broadband program alignment. Should some of that focus on where we could have these public-private partnerships or have deals where we say this house is just, we're in an area where we're not going to ever be able to lay fiber there in a practical sense, and we can afford to spend, for 30 years, we can subsidize them cheaper than we could run the fiber up there, to wait until we get the technology, as Dr. Ford says, to do something different.
Yeah, absolutely. So some programs will allow for things like satellite programs to participate. Others will not, right? So we want to be able to make it available for different technologies that can serve different communities, right? So not one technology is going to be able to serve every community. Some are going to be fiber will work just fine, and others you might need a wireless solution, you might need a mobile solution or a satellite solution. And so having that flexibility amongst programs is important.
And we should get a report from the various, how many agencies was it that are 15 agencies and 100 programs, I think?
That's
yeah. All right, I've overtaken my time, so I better yield back before I get mad at myself. I yield back and recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Castor, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank goodness the COVID-19 pandemic is over, but the pandemic did illuminate how vital the internet is to our ability to function. It also highlighted a number of obstacles, especially for many Americans in rural areas, and especially young students who are in the digital gap. Ms. Seaver, you stated in your testimony that swift congressional investments through the emergency COVID-19 aid helped communities rise to the challenge. So as we move forward and work to eliminate the gaps, give us some examples of how communities were able to accelerate digital equity and inclusion efforts in schools, and how communities continue their work to eliminate the homework gap once and for all.
Thank you for the question. So what we saw, what was really fascinating is that folks came together. Prior to the pandemic, it was there weren't many of us working on this, and then what we saw is these coalitions. So I live in Columbus, Ohio, and all of a sudden the public library, the housing authorities, the folks at the planning commission, the city, Jewish Family Services, the Y, everyone was forming a coalition to figure out how to address this, and this coalition is going strong to this day. Some of the initial efforts were quick buy computers, buy hotspots. One of the lessons learned, and we should recognize what didn't work in this also, right? One of the lessons learned was hotspots aren't the grand solution. They are a Band-Aid. They're a really important Band-Aid, but let's use a Band-Aid as a Band-Aid and then come up with permanent solutions, which is actually what we think is in the process of happening now, and why we're so excited that the states are creating those state digital equity plans, because those are long-term solutions, not Band-Aids.
So you also said the Digital Equity Act now requires states and to work on partnerships in local communities to address the gaps. What have you seen out of those plans that are innovative, and then what are the existing common barriers?
So the plans are all in development now. NDIA is not writing anybody's plan. We've been careful to say that, but we are being supportive and talking to folks as they create their plans. And we have been able to go to 12 different states to be part of their launch events. We were just in Alaska a few weeks ago, and I was fascinated to hear the conversations that were occurring at some of the tables, because Alaska's situation is so different from so many folks. And they were talking about the pros and cons of internet coming into their communities, that yes, jobs, healthcare, that's all awesome, but also human trafficking and scams, right, all of that is real. So these folks are gonna be more prepared when that comes in to create their digital inclusion programs, because they're having the conversations. So we're super excited about that.
Mr. Van Aal, you've heard what Ms. Seifer said. Now, here comes this transformational investment through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And that new law does prioritize unserved areas. Isn't that correct?
Well, it depends on how the agencies implement those specific programs in terms of making decisions about which applicants get funding. But yes, I mean, the way that they set it up, they do look for the places where they can get the biggest bang for the buck.
And that's different from how the agencies were operating before, on the scale of the resources coming in, and then with kind of a little bit of a reset in priorities for unserved areas and underserved areas.
So it's been been all over the place, really, for several of these programs. So the high-cost program has identified areas that are unserved and looked to, get providers to provide service in those areas. There's been some success in doing that, and that's also led to areas within those census blocks that have been given to those carriers where there's still no service. And so that's part of some of the gaps that some of these programs are really trying to address.
And you've really helped us focus on the need to align a lot of these initiatives. Provide some examples for us of the statutory differences that made participating difficult for communities that are most in need.
Right. So this is everything from who's eligible for the program, right? So you might have some programs where you have to be an eligible telecommunications carrier. You have to have that designation. Other programs don't have that requirement, and so it's open to a broader set of potential applicants. Definitions within programs can cause challenges, right? You have different definitions of what rural is. Even within the Department of Agriculture's 6 or 7 different programs, they all have a different definition of what rural is. And so, you may be eligible for this program based on population, but not for this program. And so it's very difficult for potential recipients to sort of weed through all of these different programs and figure out what's most appropriate for them.
Great. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Gentlelady, for yielding back. Now recognize the Gentlelady from the state of Washington and Chair of our full committee, Ms. McMorris Rodgers, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the witnesses being here. Mr. Vaughn, I noted in your testimony that you said that there's at least 133 funding programs administered across 15 agencies that can be used to support broadband access. You also said that the federal agencies have invested at least $44 billion in broadband support activities between fiscal years 2015 and 2020. Given the number of programs and the number of agencies, I'm concerned about interagency coordination. So would you speak to the communication between the agencies as they're making funding decisions, and are they checking to make sure that they're addressing potential duplication?
Sure. They assure us they are. They have regular communications and meetings. The main 4 agencies, I would say, have regular communications and meetings around what they're funding. So this would be FCC, NTIA, Rural Utility Service within the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Treasury now is included in those discussions as well. They reference the NTIA's National Broadband Accessibility Map, which tracks where federal funding is going, what service areas are being served by different programs. So they look at that. They try to make sure that whether there is an overlapping service area, because many programs do allow that kind of overlap, that the actual locations that are being served are not being served by both programs. So they go through those exercises on a regular, ongoing basis.
So if there's an incident of waste, fraud, and abuse, potential incident by a certain applicant, do they take that into consideration for future awards?
They do, although have a number of recommendations around improving most of these aid programs' ability to identify fraud risks, including waste and abuse. And so we always find, they can still improve in that area, but
Okay.
yes.
Well, overlapping programs is a key concern to me. So recently, Congress created the BEAD program, the Emergency Connectivity Program, the Affordable Connectivity Program, and then we have similar programs, High Cost, E-Rate, and Lifeline, that already existed under the Universal Service Fund. Would you just discuss how these programs and potential duplication might impact the effectiveness of federal funding?
So for the Affordable Connectivity Program, I think we've seen, relative to Lifeline, it's a larger benefit. There is, one of the things that we noted in a report we recently did on that program was that we're not sure, based on the way that they measure their performance of in that program, whether they're serving people who are new subscribers, or they're serving people who already have a subscription, but now they're getting a subsidy based on, for that subscription. And so that's one of the areas where we try to focus on getting the agencies to develop performance measures and goals so that we can sort of really track and see what the effect of these programs are. With respect to things like the BEAD program, I think it still remains to be seen exactly how that program will be rolled out. State plans are still in progress, and how that's going to interact with all of the other federal investments that are already out there is going to be sort of the big question going forward.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Ford, would you also address that same question about the new programs, the existing programs, and the impact that has on the effectiveness of federal funds?
Well, I think with the, there has to be some kind of coordination between the sorts of programs that are intended to particularly pay for on the demand side of things. We've got, at the FCC, we've got two programs. We've got a Lifeline program and an ACP program. They're funded from different sources, but their target is generally the same, which is to help low-income people afford broadband service. Why we have two of those programs is unclear. It probably makes sense to consolidate those two. I would not consolidate the two within the Universal Service Program because it's got problems and it needs a reform, and getting that money out of it might help postpone the need for reform, and that money should be from the budget and should be reviewed
Thank
by
you.
committees like this.
Yeah, thank you. Before I run out of time, you submitted to us, Dr. Ford, that the agencies need to report whether a project was actually accomplished. So would you just speak to, these unknown projects and whether or not they're being completed?
There are some cases where you can get a kind of an idea. The broadband map itself might be useful in that regard.
Okay.
It's tricky to find, particularly from RUS. I'm hard to find a number that says it was this how many lines we asked for and this is how many we got and when.
Okay.
Okay, BTOP had a lot of that information, but a lot of it was related to what you could do
Okay.
and not what you were doing.
Right.
Which, you could
Thank
do a
you.
lot of things that you
Yes.
don't do.
Thank you. My time's expired. It seems like a pretty basic question, though. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Now recognize Ms. Schakowsky of Illinois for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Really appreciate this hearing. I just want to point out that there are multiple hearings going on at the same time, and I just want to apologize for, having to come in and out, because this is such an important issue. We have been talking about closing the digital divide for years and years and years, and it is clearly still a big problem. Nearly a third of Americans really do not have access to broadband. And in my state of Illinois, it's about almost half of the low-income families that really don't have the access that they need. I am happy that the FCC's affordability connectivity program has been some help to us in the state of Illinois, and all the other programs that we've been talking about. I hope they are working, because we really need to make this happen. Ms. Seifert, I wanted to talk to you about how important is that particular program. We've seen it in Illinois, and how much progress are we seeing being made?
The Affordable Connectivity Program is incredibly important. There are actually more folks, as you just noted, who don't have access because of affordability issues and digital skills and device issues, than don't have access because it's the service, the availability is not there. Not that they're all important, right? But it means that we can't set it aside. It means we have to continue prioritizing the Affordable Connectivity Program.
So affordability, is that the key issue that is keeping us from closing the digital divide?
It's a key issue, but it's connected to all the other issues, right? Because you can't address affordability if there's not availability. And the affordability gets connected to digital skills and devices. Early days, I've been doing this work for 26 some years, and early days when people would say, oh, I just don't need it. And then the second question you'd ask them was like, why do you don't need it? Well, because I can't afford it. Right, so it gets all confused, and we have to make sure that we're diving into all the barriers.
Let me ask you this. Well, first of all, let me just ask, basically, do you think Congress needs to go further in passing legislation that would make some serious advances? And what would that be? What do you suggest that we be doing more than what we're already doing?
I absolutely agree that Universal Service Fund's contribution mechanism needs to be figured out. In order to figure that out, we need a little bit of time to figure that out, and then we can possibly have ACPB inside of the Universal Service Fund. But in order to get there, we really need Congress to extend the funding for the Affordable Connectivity Program, either extend it for a year or two or extend it for forever. Any of those solutions would be super, but we can't get to a longer-term solution if ACP just stops.
Let me ask you about education. Our kids now are using technology more in school, but when they get home, being able to continue with that work, I'm just wondering if you have any data on how the digital divide has also divided educational opportunities for our kids.
Absolutely. Common Sense Media has been a fabulous source of information on that point. We know that there are kids who go home and cannot participate in the same things that their other friends are. My children have friends who go to the library to do their homework and then aren't participating in other after-school activities because that's their only opportunity to do their homework.
Yeah. So I also wanted to ask you about the issue of, I'm kind of an organizer person. Who's doing the work on the ground to really help educate and bring people more access?
Yes, so those individuals are members of organizations that are NDIA's affiliates. We were created to serve those people you just described. They tend to be in community-based organizations, libraries, housing authorities, local governments, and now really any entity that's already trusted by low-income households who would be eligible for Affordable Connectivity Program, we encourage them to get engaged in helping folks sign up for ACP because that trust factor is so important.
I agree with that. I think the more we are in touch and in people in the communities and helping make this happen, it will happen. So thank you so much to all of you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, gentlelady, for yielding back. Now recognize the chairman of the Health Subcommittee from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, my friend from Virginia. I appreciate that very much. First, Mr. Van Aw, my question would be, as you know, the FCC continues its work to update the national broadband maps and process challenges on broadband accessibility data. These maps are more granular than was previously available, but they're still inaccuracies. I'm concerned that not enough feedback has been incorporated into the map before federal dollars are distributed to states. So my questions, and I'll list them all out and let you answer them, is how often does the FCC incorporate feedback to update the maps? And do you think that overbilling remains a concern for federal programs for that fund broadband projects? And do you have any recommendations for us to help improve the coordination between USDA, NTIA, and FCC? So how often do they incorporate the feedback?
Sure.
Is there, are you concerned about overbilling, and what can Congress do to help coordinate?
Sure. My understanding for the challenge process is that it's an ongoing process right now. They're in the midst of seeing all of these challenges and investigating and determining whether there's changes to the maps that are necessary. We haven't done extensive work to look at exactly how that process is going, but my understanding is that it is an ongoing process. As far as overbuilding, I think one of the things that like I said before, we don't see a lot of instances where same programs are building to the same locations. But overbuilding can come in many forms, right? As Mr. Ford had mentioned earlier, you don't need to necessarily have very gold-plated kind of service everywhere, right? In some locations, a different kind of solution can be appropriate. And so that's what I think we want to try to, what our recommendations have been geared towards, and what we think about when we think about a national strategy is, what are we really trying to accomplish with each of these programs? What's the best kind of service that communities need? Are we giving them what they need? And how do we go, make sure that we do that effectively and efficiently?
And does Congress have to what can Congress do to help that coordination?
So I think encouraging more of a strategic approach would be a good first step. While the agencies are all trying to move forward with implementing their programs, what FCC does and what NTIA does, they can coordinate on. We're not going to fund the same locations, but what they have trouble doing is aligning their programs, and that requires sort of a higher level sort of look, right? Has a higher authority than just the agencies themselves, because what FCC does, NTIA may or may not want to do, right?
Appreciate that. I'm going to shift over to Dr. Ford. So in Kentucky's 2nd District, a lot of my constituents lack access to broadband. And however, there's not a standard. So I want to, what Mr. Van Aw commented on your testimony, and let you expand upon a little bit. Should Congress standardize the definition across agencies of what an unserved area is? And also been concerned about advocating for changing the speed thresholds from 25 megabit to down by 3 to up by 100, down by 20. Do you think by changing the speed benchmarks for unserved and underserved communities, we risk diverting limited federal resources from the last mile to hard-reached communities?
I think there could be problems like that when it happens at the congressional level rather than the lower level. Of course, when it does happen at the congressional level, it becomes standardized to some extent, and all agencies are on the same page. I think the problem with all of that is if you set a standard at 100 megabits per second and it costs $60,000 to provide that, and I can get 58 megabits per second for $1,500, which do you want to do? It seems pretty obvious to me which way you'd go with that, particularly if you have a fixed budget. I mean, if the budget's unlimited, which it kind of looks like sometimes, except there's too much leaks out of it, then you would. So I think the strictness of the idea is problematic, is who chooses it. We need to have some understanding, and honestly, I think that understanding should come from independent people who say this is what a modern broadband connection is. It gets so political at the FCC as to what that is, and it's not motivated by anything I don't think really of any importance to people. But, you know, there are people who could honestly come up and say, I think it ought to be this. And it may be 50-10 instead of 120 or whatever. That might be perfectly adequate for people.
Okay,
And-
thank you. My time has expired, so I'll yield back to the chair. Thank you for that answer.
Thank you for yielding back. Now recognize the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize for running in and out. I'm sure several people have already said we have two very important Energy and Commerce Subcommittee hearings going on at the same time. But this particular issue is really important for me, representing Denver, Colorado, because what the pandemic crystallized for many of the members of this committee is when we think about the digital divide, we frequently talk about rural communities and tribal communities, but also in urban communities like mine, what we saw in the pandemic is we had really terrible problems in some of the lower income neighborhoods where people just had no ability to get broadband. And so the Biden administration has really demonstrated the commitment to eliminating the digital divide through historic investments, but cities need this too. And so, Ms. Seifer, I know you talked briefly earlier about your work with community partners around the country, and you talked about the digital divide, access to broadband, and the impact on so-called smart cities. But I wonder if you can broaden out a little and talk to us about how federal investments in broadband deployment and digital inclusion enable cities to plan for and provide better services, not just today on a cobbling together basis, but long into the future.
Right. So we have to look at the future. We can't just be building broadband for today. One of the realities we have in urban communities is areas that have been digitally redlined. So there are providers who've decided that they're making business decisions to put the internet service in higher wealth areas and in lower wealth areas. So it doesn't mean that the lower wealth areas don't have internet service. They do, but it's more expensive and it's slower. It's not consistent. It's not in every place, but there's enough of a pattern to see that there's a problem. So understanding that we want to focus on building out in rural areas, at the same time, we have to figure out how to address this inequity of the service that's available, the cost of the service, and how robust the service is in all of our neighborhoods across the U.S.
And is it important that we have a continuing program to build it out over time?
I'm often unpopular when I say the digital divide will never end. Technology is going to keep changing. We will bridge some divides, right? We will get everyone access to a certain speed threshold. We will get folks devices that meet certain needs. We will bridge certain divides, but other divides are going to keep creeping up. Artificial intelligence now. How is that going to change how we use technology? That could create a new divide. So yes, we have to have a permanent position and a permanent agency that always addresses this.
And what would happen if, say, when we pass the budget this year, we just cut funding for broadband affordability programs to try to get these underserved communities to get online for this year or next year? Or what happens when you have these lapses?
Millions of people will not have access to the internet, and it will be just as it was during the pandemic when we saw how it impacted health, education, work, every aspect of life.
So this is what I'm concerned about too, is when we do these budgets, and they're annual budgets. And so if we say, well, we're just going to cut this temporarily. Earlier this week, for example, a letter that all of the Republicans on this subcommittee signed, it was to the FCC's Inspector General, and it talked about the Affordable Connectivity Program as temporary and asked whether the FCC had prepared participating providers for potential lapses in ACP funding. This is what disturbs me because I'm not sure you can prepare for potential lapses in ACP funding. What's your position on that?
The preparation is for the internet service providers to know how they're going to handle it. That's the preparation side. But for the consumer side, right, you just know that you're not going to have it. There's really no preparation for that. We have to figure out how we can continue the Affordable Connectivity Program for forever, But first, Congress has to figure out how to do it in the short term, right? And then we can figure out the forever.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the chairman of the Energy Sub, a gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as a fiscal conservative and someone who believes in limited markets, limited government, free markets, individual liberties, I struggle with what the role of the federal government truly is when it comes to things like broadband and connectivity and a lot of other government programs that we are looking at cutting budgets for, because at the end of the day, government cannot be all things to all people, and it cannot afford to provide all things to all people when we're $32 trillion in debt. We just cannot continue to spend money willy-nilly in this nation to provide everything that everyone wants. Now, having said that, I'm a big fan of rural broadband and the need for access. I saw it during the pandemic in small communities in my district where Wi-Fi buses had to show up in certain areas, and parents would bring their children in close proximity to that bus so they could have access to Wi-Fi in order to do their schoolwork because they weren't in the classroom. And the only way they were going to get education is at that point, online. So there was a need, and it was satisfied with the Wi-Fi buses. So I do understand in a rural area, the 3rd Congressional District of South Carolina, that we need more rural broadband. But I also saw private industries like Western Carolina Telephone that actually invested in fiber optic in rural areas of McCormick, South Carolina. 90% of the county is owned by the federal government. It's federal land. They don't have a tax base. Abbeville County, South Carolina, same thing. It's not federal land, but a very low tax base, small population, rural area. So, I do think most areas in cities like Denver probably have some sort of access to broadband. Now, whether those consumers actually can afford to have broadband or have internet access in their home or choose to spend their money to access that internet for entertainment or educational purposes or business purposes, I understand that. But my concern is how the money that the federal government has allocated, it's already been allocated, is being spent. So I'm concerned that tens of billions of dollars have been allocated over the past few years to extend broadband services, and I'm concerned that it will end up being wasted instead of used appropriately. Ronald Reagan once wisely said the closest thing to eternal life here on earth is a government program. So there should be sunset dates for these. We should have guardrails and accountability, oversight. That's a congressional role. And I'm going to approach it from a limited government standpoint. There's a role for the free market. If you see the need for a service and you provide the service and get paid for that, that's how market economies work. So I go back to what is the role of government, and I'll end with that. Dr. Ford, I'm concerned that if we invest in the wrong technology, we'll constantly be chasing the latest, soon-to-be obsolete technology rather than making a lasting impact. So, putting fiber optic in the ground seems to make sense because it has the capacity to meet the changing technologies, whatever they may be going forward. And what we bought for this money, and shouldn't we build to last technologies that can adapt to improvement? The fiber optic in the ground is primarily what I'm thinking about. Dr. Ford?
It's possibly, we talk a lot about fiber being future-proof, but what if in 10 years the wireless networks are so advanced nobody wants a home connection anymore? How many home phone calls do you make nowadays?
Yeah.
Never.
I don't have a home phone in my house.
I don't think 15% of people have wireline phones in their house. That may turn out to be the way mobile works. It's obviously what we'd call vertically superior. It moves with you. You can take it anywhere. You can't do that with a fixed connection. So that may be the future of communications. I suspect it will be. So saying that we're making wise investments in this is really, to me, kind of puzzling. And the fact that just because that may be true doesn't mean we want to do it right now if it's $200,000 to do it. You can't get a payoff from that. I mean, that's losing money.
Yeah, real quickly, Dr. Bonar, how can we be certain not to double or triple build internet services to the same urban locations in order to ensure that rural areas, like I mentioned, 3rd Congressional District, South Carolina, get the service they need?
Right. Well, as I've said before, I think there's less duplicative funding than we think there might be in terms of what we've been able to find in our work. Programs serve similar areas, but they may not be serving the exact same locations. And so we do have some controls in place, and agencies are paying attention to that particular fact. In fact, most of the coordination the agencies do is about trying to avoid that kind of duplication. I would just mention, in terms of the role of the private sector and the government, the private sector is still building out infrastructure. They're the main providers of internet infrastructure everywhere. And the high-cost program and other federal programs are really trying to incentivize those companies to extend service to those areas where they really don't have an economic incentive to do so. So just to mention that.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding back. Now recognize Ms. Lesko of Arizona for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, all of the three of you, for being here today. Obviously, we're spending billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars on this project, and so I think it's very important that we get this right so we don't have the waste and fraud. I think, Mr. Ford, you thought the speed that we're doing this at, we might lose 20% of the funding, which is very, troubling, obviously. Mr. Van, the American Rescue Plan authorized $10 billion for the Capital Projects Fund, which provides money to states, territories, and tribal governments to fund critical capital projects that enable work, education, and health monitoring in response to the public health emergency. Does the Department of Treasury have the expertise and capability to effectively administer this program, given that they do not traditionally oversee broadband funding?
Well, thank you for that question. We haven't looked specifically at that particular program, and so it's a little hard for me to comment on whether they have the expertise, but I will mention that they are participating now with other agencies in, ongoing coordination meetings so that they understand exactly what NTIA and FCC and other and agriculture are doing. And so that's an encouraging sign that Treasury is now part of that MOU between those agencies.
Thank you. And in a similar question, Mr. Ford, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program is a $42.45 billion NTIA program established by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to deploy broadband infrastructure. In your opinion, is the NTIA properly equipped to direct and oversee this large amount of funding?
No.
Thank you. My next question is also for Mr. Ford. Broadband providers are subject to significant permitting delays at the local and federal levels. With funding going out the door for multiple different broadband programs, all having various timelines and regulations, do you agree that a uniform permitting application would help solve this problem?
I mean, it seems like it would, at a general level. Implementation might prove tricky, but yeah, ease that process would make it better. It's part of the hurry problem, right? Hurry up and do something, and then wham, 8 months later, you get to submit a letter to ask permission to cross a street. So that's all part and parcel of it. But if that could be simplified, it would most surely help.
So related to that, do you think that permitting reform is something that Congress should do this year?
I think it would be reasonable to do that, and maybe even pole attachments and rights-of-way stuff. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Van, would it be reasonable and effective to have a single agency that administers all broadband programs?
So just to go back to the number of programs we have, I would just mention that many of them do not have broadband as their main purpose. And so right now we have 4 agencies that really have the bulk of the funding: FCC, NTIA, Department of Agriculture. and Treasury. And so for many of those programs, you know, they have other purposes, economic development, community development, whatever it may be. Whether one agency would be most appropriate, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, in some ways, I want to say yes, in the sense that, you know, you have it all in one, you have one agency who is focused on this, but the FCC is not an administrative branch agency. It's an independent commission. They function off of the Universal Service Fund that's collected through taxes on our phone bills, whereas NTIA, being an executive branch agency, has a different function, right? So they're looking at, you know, the strategic plan and goals of the Department of Commerce. So those things are different. You know, would it be better if it had one agency to do that? Perhaps, but communications issues are spread across a number of agencies.
Thank you for your answer. Yeah, it just seems to me common sense that if you have all these different programs and a whole bunch of different agencies trying to do, have the same goal, that you're going to inevitably overspend money. And we're talking about U.S. taxpayer dollars. And so we all have a goal, but we don't want to waste taxpayer dollars. And with that, I yield back.
Now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Ruiz, for his 5 minutes. Mr. Ruiz, you need to turn your microphone on.
Started, good. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Broadband is now a necessity, not a luxury, and we need to treat it as such. We saw during the COVID-19 pandemic that the ability to participate in remote learning, telework, and telehealth was critical to people's well-being and survival and our nation's recovery. We should be treating broadband access like the common good that it is, which means we need to make sure that reliable, high-speed broadband connections are available in order to improve the public's health, increase educational access, boost our small businesses, and reduce disparities and give everyone a real chance to access basic, necessary resources and share in our country's prosperity. Without it, communities are being left behind and everyone is at a disadvantage. I want to particularly focus on the importance of the broadband programs for tribal areas and the funding that Congress has provided over the years. My bill, the Tribal Broadband Deployment Act, was included in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2018 and required the FCC to assess broadband availability on tribal lands and bring broadband internet to these underserved areas. Between 2018 and 2021, the portion of people living on tribal lands who don't have access to broadband dropped from 35% to 21%. That's an improvement, but let me repeat, 21% of people living on tribal lands still do not have access to broadband. That is compared to just only 4% of Americans overall. So while the progress we have made should be celebrated, there's obviously much more to do. That is why I'm encouraged by the 2021 Bipartisan Infrastructure Law's transformational $65 billion investment in broadband, which includes $2 billion specifically for tribal broadband programs. My district has suffered from underinvestment for years, and I am proud that we are finally bringing federal resources that promote equity and help those most in need. But I will also remain vigilant to ensure that tribal voices are heard and their unique needs are met. Ms. Seifer, I know that last March, you and other members of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance held a tribal broadband boot camp in Southern California. Thank you for coming to my part of the country and working to close the digital divide. Can you tell us what unique challenges do tribal communities face in participating in broadband programs?
Right. One of the things that NDIA is doing now is helping tribes create their own digital equity programs. So it's one thing to make sure that the infrastructure is available, which they're doing, and some tribes actually own their own internet service providers, and that's amazing, right? Because then there's that control there. And what we're also finding is that those same internet service providers are also providing digital navigation service. So they're the ones that also helps teach their neighbors and their elders how to use the internet, how to get connected. That's a uniqueness. We don't see that elsewhere. I would not encourage any other internet service provider to provide those services, but it does happen in tribal communities because there is a closeness that is not the same in other places.
How do they get started? What are the barriers for them to even get started in participating in these programs?
It's the connectivity itself, the device, because carrying around a mobile phone does not mean that you can create a resume or you can work on have your telehealth appointment. So it's the skills, the devices, and the connectivity. all
Do
three.
tribes need technical support?
Tribes need technical support,
Grant
but it needs
writers?
to be technical support that comes from within the community.
Okay. Mr. Von Ott, recent GAO reports have shown that tribal lands continue to lag behind the rest of the country in broadband access. What should the federal government do to close this gap, and how can Congress help agencies take these steps?
Absolutely. Our work has shown and highlighted a number of the difficulties that tribal communities face in trying to access federal programs. They're eligible for many of them, but they are not very successful in getting funding necessarily. And then the carriers that they rely upon, if they don't have their own internet carrier or internet service provider, they may not trust them, they may not be able to partner with them, and so there's some difficulties there. The Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program that was created is the first program really to focus specifically on getting funding out to tribal communities for broadband connectivity. But our recommendations around this have been in terms of creating a national strategy, to have a tribal focus within that national strategy, because there are so many unique issues related to tribal communities and tribal lands, as well as for NTIA's Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth to have a specific work stream to focus on trying to overcome those barriers that tribes face in accessing federal programs.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. Now recognize the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong, for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to follow up a little bit on what Ms. Lesko was talking about and Director Von Ott, your previous testimony. There are 133 funding programs from over 15 federal agencies that support broadband access. At least $44 billion has been spent from fiscal years 2015 to 2020. We've discussed a lot about how this duplicative and inefficient bureaucracy creates challenges and how streamlining would help. But what we haven't heard yet is an economic estimate of how much this inefficiency actually costs. Do you, Director Von Ott, how much is potential savings from streamlining the agencies involved in their rows, avoiding duplicative grants, standardizing policies, definitions, eligibility standards, and just eliminating other bureaucratic inefficiencies?
We haven't done the work to give you a really clear answer on that, but certainly there is overhead involved with running multiple programs within multiple agencies. Just for NTIA itself, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, particularly because there's 4 agencies that do require the bulk of it, so the other 131, it's one piece of all of the other things they do, right?
Right, so there's, of the other programs, 63 of them are really, they can only fund broadband under certain circumstances. They have other purposes, right? So they're not really, they can support broadband, but they're not focused on broadband. So the main 4 agencies are really where the bulk of the funding lies.
Dr. Ford, do you have any idea, any estimate of how much this inefficiencies cost? Is there a way to do this estimate? Even when we're talking about it, we know we've spent at least $44 million. We can't even pin down exactly what we've spent.
I suspect you could possibly construct an estimate by comparing performance across agencies, if you could get the data, which is not always easy to get, and see, how productive the spending was in achieving some kind of goal. And I think what that's going to tell you is that agency A should be used and not agency B, more than there's some global inefficiency of multiple agency activity. But you might could come up with something like that.
The complexity of these support activities, and I just believe figuring out a way to simplify them, particularly if you can cut out a portion of these ones who only touch it in a minor way, would just help in the overhead and the bureaucratic malaise that exists in this space.
I think overhead would be a big part of it, for sure. And you're just duplicating certain roles that don't need to be duplicated. Guys that do all the data collection and management, you don't need, 4 sets of those guys really. It might be 50% more than the one firm because you might need a little more. And then the data would be the same, you know, and people could access it in a way that was comparable. Now you get it from all the different sources and different formats. It doesn't line up. You don't have the same information. It's kind of a mess.
And thank you. And with that, I yield to the chairman.
Thank the gentleman. I've heard of some cases, Mr. Von Ah, where NTIA has not awarded grants for many months after receiving applications. In GAO's view, are there particular statutes preventing effective distribution of federal broadband funds?
I wouldn't say that there were statutes that were preventing that. For the newer programs that NTIA has been authorized to execute, there's just been a ramp up for them to get staff available to put NOFOs out, to have the various processes in place to be able to process the number of applications they've gotten. And they've also gotten these programs have been, have more applicants and funding than the programs have available. So they've been trying to weed through a lot of information.
You all recommended that we do some program alignment to make things, to eliminate some of these redundancies. What was NTIA's feedback with undertaking of this recommendation?
They agreed with that recommendation, and then the agencies all point to some of these things are in statute, and Congress has to make some changes too. So we recommended that they identify those things that are in statute and report to you on what changes.
And they haven't gotten that done yet, have they?
They have not done that yet.
All right. All right. Did you hear any hesitation or complaints from them on accomplishing these recommendations or this recommendation?
No.
Okay. I yield back to the gentleman from North Dakota, who I assume then yields back to me.
Yields back to you, Mr.
All
Chairman.
right. I appreciate that. Now I recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chair Griffith. Thank you, Ranking Member Castor, and appreciate our witnesses being here today. A recent tragedy near my district in upstate New York has had me thinking about how much we can take technology for granted. In many places these days, we assume that we have ready access to the outside world. Our phones work and our internet works. But just last month, a 20-year-old named Kaylin Gillis, a resident of my district, was shot and killed when she and her friends mistakenly drove up the wrong driveway in a nearby rural town. Despite being not far from New York's capital city and other larger cities, her friends had to drive several miles just to find cell coverage to reach 911. By the time they got help, Kaylin had passed away. While we are focused primarily on broadband internet today, I do think that this horrible and senseless tragedy must serve as a reminder that there are many places where phone coverage or broadband internet access have not caught up to the rest of the country. We need to do the important work to close that digital divide in all of our communities. I've been working for a long time to expand broadband access to unserved and underserved communities. In December of 2020, my Bipartisan Access Broadband Act was enacted as part of the 2021 Consolidated Appropriations Act. The law established the Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth, known as OICG, at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. OICG is charged with tracking broadband funding across agencies, supporting small businesses and local communities, and improving coordination amongst the government and private sector elements. Mr. Von Ah, when your team examined federal investments in broadband before November of 21, it found that numerous broadband programs lacked coordination. The OICG was established in August of 21, just a few months before that evaluation was finalized. Has GAO examined interagency coordination on broadband since that it took the lead on interagency coordination? And if so, what did GAO find?
We have looked at interagency coordination within the context of specific programs since then. So, for example, we looked at the Reconnect program and how the Department of Agriculture was coordinating with FCC, NTIA, and others to ensure that they weren't duplicating funding. Our understanding of where OICG is right now is that they're using the American Broadband Initiative, which is a coalition of broadband stakeholders, as a way to help coordinate these issues. Our recommendations to them were to have, to expand the role of that ABI to include tribal issues as a tribal work stream within that ABI, and they're still they were still ramping up to undertake that role. But that's our understanding where they are.
But it sounds like they're moving in a good direction. Okay, what are some concrete steps that Congress can take to further improve interagency coordination when it comes to broadband?
So for us, our recommendations were really to sort of seek a national strategy, so congressional support for a national strategy would be helpful.
Thank you. And my Bipartisan Access Broadband Act also makes it easier for businesses and local leaders to bring federal funding to underserved and unserved areas in need of broadband access. But the federal government needs to know which communities are most in need of support if we are indeed going to make the most of our efforts. Engaging with community leaders to understand what's happening on the ground is critical to success, including in developing an accurate map of who has access to reliable high-speed broadband and who does not. So, Ms. Seifer, how can collaboration between agencies and communities help ensure that our dollars are making the most impact?
It's the deployment side, and then it's also the access side. And so what's interesting about the GAO report is that it includes the broadband adoption along with the deployment. And so separating out, which I think the director has done today, separating out which ones are specifically focused on broadband adoption and which ones are focused on the deployment, that interaction is somewhat occurring now, and we're seeing also the coordination not only from them, but the state offices, which is not something that we've talked about today, but has been included in the legislation.
Wonderful. And how can Congress help agencies better collaborate with the communities?
I agree that this strategy is something that we need everyone to get behind. It was suggested by lots of folks early on, but we were also busy with lots of things that it didn't happen, and it needs to happen.
Okay, well, these programs are too important to let them fall prey to partisan attacks and indiscriminate budget cuts. We need to work together to close this digital divide. If we don't, the people who lose the most are our constituents and communities. And it sounds like we're making progress, and I appreciate that. And with that, I'm out of time, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. Now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for hosting this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing. Dr. Ford, in your testimony, you describe how some agencies run a cost-benefit analysis to verify how much positive results we get from our broadband investments, but some of them obviously don't. And one example, in your written statement, you called one of the department's commitments of $33 million for 211 homes and 5 businesses as irresponsible and disrespectful of the tax subsidy imposed on Americans. Then you contrasted that with the state of Georgia, where the investment serves 76,700 locations, which you found reasonable. How does an agency responsible for committing these funds, allocating these funds, not know they would obtain so little return on such a large broadband investment?
That's a great question. I feel like the only person ever asking about the cost and benefits of deploying a broadband circuit. I've been shouted down at academic conferences for even raising the issue that it might not be worth spending $100,000 to get broadband to a household if it's only worth $30,000 or $20,000. They just don't ask that question, and maybe because they've never been asked to ask that question. Here's a giant pot of money, go spend it, is pretty much their direction. But I think that definitely needs to be incorporated into the thinking. There are cases where it's just too expensive to do, and we need to be finding an alternative. And there's just no talk of that.
Well, I think the key here is that we don't want to deny last mile service, but we should be evaluating alternatives to provide that service. I think any agency that's committing funds for any project needs to be fully aware of the cost-benefit analysis. They ought to go about this the way the private sector does, to do that type of analysis. But I want to shift gears here a little bit. If you were constructing a cost-benefit analysis for a federal program responsible for giving broadband dollars, what factors would you take into account?
Well,
and if you could be brief, I want to ask Director Von Aw a couple of questions.
That was good. I was about to lead into that from what you had said. Why aren't we doing just a traditional net present value calculation on the investment? What is it going to sell for? How much money am I investing? How long time do I have to do this? And then, we're going to have to contemplate some sort of social value from these investments, otherwise we wouldn't make them at all. I think it's reasonable to say that the social value of a service is not more than its private value, and private value is something that can be calculated with reasonable accuracy, which is what I did in my testimony. So I think, where is the model, that tracks this out over 20 years and says we're green 6 years out,
Well, one of the reasons this hearing is so important is first and foremost, we want to get broadband service to people, but at the same time, and the GAO does a really good job about evaluating some of these programs, we've reached our debt limit. We're at almost $32 trillion in debt. We cannot afford to spend money the way we're spending money. We need to do a cost-benefit analysis. We should have been doing this for years. Director Von Aw, in your written testimony, you mentioned that some programs restrict federal funding to single-use deployment, which can mean that nearby or co-located schools, clinics, other businesses would need to seek separate program funding for broadband. Are there other examples of program requirements like this that unnecessarily drive up the cost of broadband deployment?
There are a number of programs that are specific to things like schools and libraries, or for educational purposes, or for telehealth and things of that nature. It depends on whether the surrounding area and those businesses and locations have actual infrastructure that can provide service or not, as to whether they would need to seek other federal funding to build that infrastructure. But there are a number of programs that have that quality to them, yes.
So has the GAO taken an in-depth look at the mapping process when it comes to determining broadband availability?
We have not taken a deep look at FCC's new mapping process. We've had a number of recommendations previously for FCC to improve its maps, and we've commented on in a number of reports about the inaccuracy of the 477 data, but we haven't looked in depth at the current maps.
Well, any information that the GAO could provide to us, to this committee, I think that helps improve this process would be very valuable. Thank you for your response. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. Now recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Kamick, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Griffith, for hosting this hearing today. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing before us on obviously a very important topic, albeit a little bit of a complicated one. I'll go straight to you, Mr. Ford. In past funding announcements for Reconnect, the rural utility service has lowered the unserved threshold from 90% to 50% of households without internet service in an area without proper justification for that area to be eligible for funding. Do you believe that it is important for this threshold to remain high for Reconnect in order to target the truly unserved areas, or would you have another number that you would ping that at?
I think it should be high, unless, I guess what bothers me is they can't find any place. I mean, we're going on and on and on about places that don't have it, and they can't find one with 100%. That's kind of strange. I mean, you loosen up the boundary when you can't spend your money, right? You can't find a project at 90%, so he says, well, let's make it 50. Why can't you find a project at 90%? Are we just so far along that we've solved the problem already? This is kind of what it sounds like. No, I think it should be unserved first, and then some underserved, yes, and sometimes you got to combine. I mean, some guy might want to say, oh, I can do both of these for cheaper than I could do, two people could do them independently. There are some complexities with stuff like that. But until we're done, it should be a very high threshold towards, it should be unserved first, and then underserved, a very high threshold until all that other stuff gets taken care of. Now, I suppose the problem for them is that maybe people don't come and ask, and that there are unserved areas that aren't going to the RUS and saying, hey, can I get some money? Maybe that's the problem. I don't know.
And on the definition of underserved, do you think that requires some updating or tweaking?
I think you have to sort of set some kind of standard. I mean, it doesn't have to be, don't have to think about it so strictly as we often do, but there's probably some level of service that you might reasonably conclude is probably not good enough. I mean, today that might be 10 megabits a second,
Okay.
something like that.
Should entities be barred from receiving funds under Reconnect if those entities have already received funding from other federal, state, or local broadband programs for those same areas?
If it's exactly the same places, yes, I think there should be restrictions on that.
I think we saw that under RDOF.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about, should the Reconnect program be subject to the same Administrative Procedure Act requirements for funding announcements like all other federal programs?
That's kind of getting into a legal question, but I do think any project should be well documented and publicly available for people to see. Should not be hard to find, should not be hard to combine with other sources, and it should be complete. I mean, I was looking at some RUS stuff today, and it's just incomplete. And then even some of the SEC stuff, which is generally pretty good about providing data, you have to look in a bunch of different places to try to piece it together, and it jumps between USAC and the FCC, and the USAC website's kind of clumsy. But that shouldn't be. I mean, it should be brought in together in a very nice data set that can be downloaded and analyzed, you know?
Do you believe that all broadband funding decisions should be based on the same maps in order to prevent wasteful spending and overbuilding in areas?
I think that it should be strongly related to a map. Okay, there are going to be weird cases where that might not work out. I understand, but everybody should be kind of on the same page as what they're doing. Otherwise, people are going to say, "Oh, the FCC says I don't have it, you know, or I do have it, and I don't have it, and I go get the money." And it may not be true, but you should challenge the FCC map rather than convince some organization who's barely in the business of broadband subsidies to give you money because there's some confusion.
Absolutely.
You know?
Well, and I'm coming close to the end of my time, so again, I appreciate it. Thank you to our witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady for yielding back. I'll take a second to apologize to Mr. Wahlberg. This is what happens when we have numerous committees going at the same time. I thought we were very close to being done, and then everybody started showing up. After I sent word to Mr. Wahlberg, he needed to be here in 5 minutes. But we appreciate you being patient and recognizing that we sometimes have these issues. I now recognize Mr. Wahlberg for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I get it. Being the stepchild on this committee, by having to wave on it, I understand it. And I just appreciate you giving me the chance to wave on. As co-chair of the Rural Broadband Caucus, proper oversight of our nation's broadband funding programs is one of my top priorities. My district stretches literally from Lake Michigan to Lake Erie and everything in between. And every week we field calls and letters from constituents who do not have access to a reliable internet connection, and I mean access, period. Affordability and literacy are issues we can continue to discuss, but connection doesn't even reach so many parts of southern Michigan, and we're not talking about hills and valleys and mountains in Michigan, especially in the southern portion. We need to get rural America online for the agricultural interests as well. The hearing memo and Mr. Von Ah's testimony highlight a major concern I've shared since GAO Studies was published last year, how the lack of a national strategy for broadband is impeding deployment. In response to the GAO report last Congress, I worked with my colleagues in the Senate to introduce bipartisan bicameral legislation, the proper leadership to align Networks for Broadband Act, or Plan for Broadband Act. The Plan for Broadband Act would implement many of the recommendations that Mr. Von Ah has discussed today. Under administration leadership, it instructs all the offices of jurisdiction to come together to create a coordinated strategy for broadband deployment with set goals and markers for each program. It asks agencies to identify barriers to deployment and ways that we can streamline permitting processes for broadband infrastructure. But most importantly, it requires that the agencies consult with states, localities, and providers, the people really on the ground, on what the strategy should look like. This will help ensure that funds get to the rural areas that need it most so we can truly close the digital divide. Mr. Von Ah, the GAO report recommends that the Executive Office of the President develop and implement the National Broadband Strategy, but others have argued that the responsibility should fall to NTIA. Given their expertise and history of federal coordination, would NTIA be better suited to leading the strategy for the administration?
So certainly NTIA should have a prominent role in developing that strategy and leading that strategy. The reasoning behind our putting it in the White House's purview was because we saw that there were issues across agencies. You had multiple agencies involved in multiple programs. And so if NTIA creates a strategy, it doesn't necessarily have any bearing on what FCC might be doing or RUS within the Department of Agriculture. And so we saw that a need for a national strategy that was at a higher level that went across agencies. But certainly, I think having NTIA having a lead role and having a significant input into that strategy is extremely important.
Because of the background, the knowledge, the information, the contact.
And the administrator of the NTIA is the advisor to the administration on broadband, on telecommunications issues.
Okay. Another hurdle to deployment that GAO identified is the significant workforce shortages in the telecommunications industry. And I just left Education Workforce Committee, which is concerned about that very thing. Without a robust workforce, no amount of money can get people connected. And so, Mr. Van Aw, the report indicated that we would need 34,000 additional workers during peak deployment to support the broadband expansion programs. The need for workers is especially acute in rural areas, even now before the bulk of funds have gone out the door. Why is that the case, and how can rural communities and businesses grow their skilled telecommunications workforce?
Right. So in terms of the workforce, our estimates were based on looking at how the funding will be allocated over the next several years. There's a number of uncertainties about that estimate, but really what we're seeing is just there's a lot of demand for the same kinds of workers. With the IIJA and a number of other areas, you've got a number of infrastructure projects that all demand the similar kinds of skills and abilities. And so there's just a lot of demand. You've got an aging workforce, and you've got sort of sometimes not the best working conditions, and a lot of travel sometimes involved as well. And so there are a lot of challenges that need to be overcome. But building those skills in local areas, I think, would be something that would be useful.
Okay. Well, seeing my time is almost up, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. Now recognize Mr. Allen of Georgia for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also thank you for allowing me to wave on. And but this is an important, very important in my district, and improving broadband service has been a top priority of mine. Of course, I hear it from my constituents on a regular basis. But for all these years, we spent talking about this issue after the creation of 130 separate broadband subsidy programs in 15 different agencies, and after the appropriation of over $100 billion for broadband-related purposes since 2015, it's kind of hard to understand why this issue has not been resolved. One of the main reasons from my perspective is a lack of accurate broadband maps, which I think you've probably heard over and over here today. The FCC's broadband maps are notoriously inaccurate, and in the 116th Congress, we passed the Broadband Data Act to fix this, which was signed into law. This law requires the FCC to completely rehaul their maps, but it's been 3 years now. Mr. Van Aw, I understand that the FCC will release new maps this month. How would you evaluate their implementation of the Broadband Data Act?
Well, we haven't looked very closely at their implementation of the Broadband Data Act, but we did look very early on at their ability to develop the national fabric, which is sort of the basis of the maps, which identifies all the serviceable locations in the country. We identified a number of challenges associated with that, but FCC was recognizing those challenges. And
do you think we can expect federal broadband funds to be dispersed more effectively once the Broadband Data Act is fully implemented?
That would be the hope.
I know that even once these maps are fully updated, there's still not requirements for other federal broadband programs to award funds based on them. Dr. Ford, could you walk us through the inefficiencies that might create this?
Trying to allocate the subsidies by the new maps?
Right.
Well, hopefully they're better. And and that way we won't be spending money where we don't. I think too that the higher precision of the locations will make sure that the locations can be tracked better as to what has been served and what has not, and possibly along the way find things that we didn't think were there that are there, because there are actually going to be people out there deploying network. I think that's important, and I think there are a lot of non-map ways to be addressing some of this problem too. If you got constituents calling and saying, I don't have broadband, send somebody out there and check. And make sure that the map squares up that way. And if not, then try to figure out how to get broadband there. But I think we're just gonna have to wait and see how good that map is, and then what sort of requirements the NTIA and the states put on providers to tell us what it is they're doing and when they've done it. I mean, that's the main thing, is to find out that they did spend the money correctly.
Well, certainly, we need to hold the government accountable for these funds and what we're doing, and you pointed that out in your testimony as far as the cost per connection. Another frustration is that, most third world countries have better cell service than I do in the 12th District of Georgia. Dr. Ford, could you talk about this disconnect? Is universal cell service feasible?
Sure. Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by universal. Every square foot, I don't know, but and for covering most of the population, which tends to live in very few places and travel along certain roads a lot, we can have very high cellular coverage. There's always going to be issues with certain areas. I mean, if you're low or you're in a certain spot, and a lot of the problems from that come from localities who refuse to allow towers to be located or expanded. That's been a huge problem in the wireless industry. They can't grow their network all the time when they need to. So that
as far as permits and that sort of
Yeah.
thing. Mr. Von Hall, are there programs already in place that are intended to expand cell service?
The Mobile Connectivity Fund within the high-cost funds, set of funds, is one that's meant to try to encourage rural areas and growth in rural areas.
Okay,
That's-
great. Well, hey,
For
thanks.
the most part, they're not.
Thanks for being here today, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to wave on.
I thank the
yield back.
gentleman. We're always glad in this subcommittee, it's been long, and in this committee, it's been a long tradition to let people wave on, because if you're on the committee, you sometimes have an interest even in areas that you're not on, can't be on all the subs, and you can't be at all the hearings, so we let people wave on. There are no further members wishing to ask questions, so I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. In pursuant to committee rules, I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, and I ask that witnesses submit their responses within 10 days upon receipt of those questions. Without objection, committee stands adjourned.
You're the most sighted guy around. It's funny how things you write down sometimes just catch, man. It's a good show. I'm glad you were here. You know all the dirty details about this. Congratulations.
Somebody tweeted it out, and it's like, well, thank you for inviting us.
It was great to meet you also.
I gotta ask, we were just debating, are you from northern Alabama?
I grew up in Gadsden.
Thank you. The key, I don't pick up the accent. The key is very similar to a lot of people in my mountains, which of course are the same mountains, just down the road as far as the mountains are
I
concerned.
picked up my accent most heavily.
Thank you for letting me come here.
Sure. We want him
Oh,
back.
there he is. We were just talking about you.
We want him back eventually.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
North Alabama.
Yeah. See, Andrew?
Yeah, I can see you, Mike. How you been?
Jade told me everything went well, so.
I don't get any of the ride tonight.
Yeah.
The cadence is very similar.
We're sending out some letters, like 20 different letters to like data workers and stuff, and so it's like about to go out, so I'm like just doing all those last minute corrections.
I don't know where I'm just kind of got together. And then I came to Washington and I kind of took a lot of it. And I'm back in Alabama and I took it back up.
There you go.
Yeah. I thought it was going to do a joke.
I know.
We have a Japanese so he came to me. Lord, did you bring your trash? And I was going to say, everything is policy.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Good info.
Absolutely. Happy to help and stuff. Thank you for coming.
We're
There
probably
was a lot of interest in looking at the new maps. So
Yeah.
we don't have any work that's requested or planned right now. So if there's some interest in that, we'd be happy to work with you. Okay.
All right. Very good. Thank you.
My accent's a little different.
Yeah.
But, it's nice to meet you.
Say hi to Cape Ford. Mr. Ford,
Well, all right, man. Good show.
good to meet you, yeah. Good to see you. Or one or two where I was like really pulling from multiple things. Workforce issues are really the tough ones.
I come because